Welcome to the Reason and Theology Show. I'm your host, Michael Lofton. Thursday evening. Doing a show here on communion in the hand, in the West, in the first millennium. And, before we dive in, I want to preface this entire video by just saying a couple remarks on what I think about communion in the hand. In today's climate, where people haphazardly receive the host and leave all kinds of particles of the host on their hand, and are not attentive to that and recognizing that Christ is fully present in every particle, body, blood, soul, and divinity, and the fact that people are careless about it and will drop it on the floor and it's being trampled on. Do I think in today's climate that the way that we do communion in the hand is a good idea? No, obviously not. I'm not opposed to it in principle, but it definitely can't be done in the way we're doing it today. Is communion on the tongue a little bit safer? Yeah. Yep. Is that necessarily the solution that we ought to take? Not necessarily. I think that there's ways that we could do things that are more in keeping with our tradition, as I'm going to show, that would also respect the host. But at the same time, I'm a realist, and I realize that things for the better won't change overnight, only things for the worse. But we at least already have an established practice of communion on the tongue in a safe way, whereas we don't have a safe version of communion on the hand. So, the quicker option in dealing with this problem is just communion on the tongue, right? But maybe long term, I think it would be possible if we could maybe restore that practice, or intinction or something like that. But I'm also not opposed to communion on the tongue being the preferable way moving forward. So the point is, however you do it, the most important thing is that we are reverent and not being disrespectful or trampling on particles of the host. But whichever form ultimately doesn't matter. Do some forms safeguard against certain abuses? Sure. Yeah. But at the same time, I'm bringing this up because we hear so often today with the post-conciliar reforms that they are just novel. Novelty, novelty, novelty. The problem is, it's actually the Tridentine practices and the late Baroque liturgical practices that are novel. That's what's novel. A lot of the things that we have in the liturgical reform are not novel compared to what we have. What we have today, with the Tridentine rite. Now, again, I'm not putting it down. Overall, it's in much better shape. The Latin Mass is in much better shape, and here by Latin Mass, I'm referring to the Tridentine Mass. The Tridentine Mass is in a whole lot better shape than the average Novus Ordo parish, of course. But we're just saying, if we're going to talk about this thing objectively, is communion in the hand in and of itself sacrilege and novel and things like that? No, it's not. In fact, it's communion on the tongue that's novel. I think it was a lawful change that the church made. The church had every right to make that, and there was reasons why the church shifted from communion in the hand in the first millennium to communion on the tongue towards the very end of the first millennium into the second millennium. And I'm going to prove that it was actually the practice of the first millennium, for the most part, to have practice communion on the hand, and it was rare to have communion on the tongue. That's what I'm going to show. But before that, I do that. We have to have a little continuation of Comedy Hour. And no, I'm not saying I'm going to review that pastor's material further. I'm not. I think he took a beating enough already. So we'll talk about some other things here. No, I have something fun for y'all that y'all may or may not have seen, but this was sent to me the other day. This is a Coptic deacon ordering a latte at Starbucks, I guess, and he orders it in the same way he would chant the liturgy. And I loved it. I absolutely loved this. I think this is the greatest thing ever. So I'm going to play it for y'all, and then we're going to talk about communion in the hand. Here we go. Coptic deacon.
And then make the iced latte with the almond milk, please. And the white chocolate mocha.
Yeah, and a grande white chocolate mocha.
And the grande for the iced one. Thank you.
And a grande and an iced latte.
Yes! Good! And then
the guy actually got the order right. That's what kills me. Is he understood all that? I want to know who this guy is, and if I can, if somebody could maybe point me to maybe a liturgy that he's done that's online, because I would listen to his liturgy all day long. His part of the liturgy, I just have on repeat. He does the chanting there very, very well, even though it's about a mocha ice latte or whatever it is he ordered. I still thought it was great. So I had to show that to y'all. Anyways, let's get to it. Let's talk about, let me see here. Let me close that out. Talk about communion in the hand. Okay. So again, some points here about communion in the hand in the first millennium. Some of this is going to be stuff you don't hear often. Some of it will be stuff you've heard. Some of it will be probably new information to you. And that's what I think is problematic. And I'm not calling out anybody or naming any names, but you can type in Google history of communion in the hand on Google, and you'll have a series of articles that come up, and they basically say the same thing. And they are misinformed. They're misinformed. They tend to think that, okay, it was exceptional that there was communion in the hand. Hold on, let me turn this heater off. Yeah, they think it's exceptional that there was communion in the hand. And it was mostly the practice of having communion on the tongue, whereas it's actually the inverse in the first millennium. It was mostly communion in the hand, it would seem, and more of a rare thing to have communion on the tongue. Again, I'm not saying these weren't necessary or legitimate changes that the church made in the second millennium or towards the end of the first millennium. I understand why. I get it. And it coincided with us changing from leavened bread to unleavened bread. I get why. I understand. Not opposed to it. And I think the church has all authority, so it has that right to do that, right? Unless it's something that is contrary to a teaching of an apostle, it's possible to do that. And, it could be argued that, in fact, that Jesus actually was using unleavened bread at the Passover, and in fact himself confected the Eucharist with unleavened bread because, of course, during this time, a Jew was not allowed to have yeast in their house. So it'd be unlikely that he used leavened bread. So, but it does seem that pretty quickly the early church shifted to leavened bread, and then it was towards the end of the second millennium that the West changed back to unleavened bread. And again, I think it's fine. I mean, I don't have a problem with the church doing that. The church has every right to, and I understand its logic. But let's just keep things in perspective. If we're going to accuse the post-conciliar church of liturgical novelty, you need to consider the novelty that you, Mr. Latin Mass goer, are guilty of. You need to recognize that you have some novelty in your liturgy. And again, I might be right there defending the novelty with you, or the innovation, whatever you want to call it. I might be right there with you defending it. But you still need to recognize it is what it is. So you really can't say a whole lot about the post-conciliar reforms in the matter of novelty. All you can really say is, well, I think that some of these post-conciliar reforms, though not novel, they weren't helpful because of the way in which they were done. That's fine. You have you have a leg to stand on when you say that. But don't talk to me about novelty in the post-conciliar liturgical era when every Orthodox is looking at you thinking, wait, you don't recognize the novelty in your own Mass? Not that the Orthodox don't have novelty in their liturgy. They do. They do. We all do. We all do. So, let's talk about some of these quotes here. First one on your screen. I don't know if y'all can see that really well on y'all's end. If it's too small, let me know. Let me see if I can maybe zoom in a little bit. You know, somebody's saying, novelties aren't bad simply for being novel. I agree. Some of them were necessary. They're not forbidden. What is forbidden is novel doctrines, right? I mean that's a problem. It should at least go back. Your teachings need to at least go back substantially to the deposit of faith, or are so intimately connected to something in the deposit of faith that if you were to deny it, you're implicitly denying something in the deposit of faith, and you really couldn't safeguard the deposit of faith. So you have to have all of that. Absolutely. So there's a sense in which we could talk about some novelty there. If we're drawing out implications of something and necessary implications of the deposit of faith. But something beyond that entirely, I wouldn't say that you could impose that necessarily on the church definitively. Definitively, no, you can't. No, you can't. That would be adding to the deposit of faith. And then there's, of course, that's teachings. And then there are some novelties that are liturgical and disciplinary. The church has that authority. Unless, and Joachim is asking, is this live? Yes, indeed it is. So you can ask some questions in the chat, and I can probably get to them here in a little bit. So, I mean, we could talk about some novelty in liturgy and discipline. We all have it. Catholics and Orthodox, we all have it. Protestants too, you have it too. Some more than others, but we all have it. Now, there is a point in which that can go too far, though. You can be too novel, and it ends up causing a problem with something that is apostolic, and I would say that's then an issue, right? So, I mean, I'm not saying it's, hey, you can have novelty and it's just a blank check. No. It's not what I'm saying here. It's not what I'm saying. But there is a sense in which the church has some freedom in determining some things. It has some freedom. The church, for example, has some freedom in determining the form of ordination. To an extent, not a blank check, but to an extent. We've seen that. We've seen it with Pius XII. Pius XII compared to Florence. We've seen that. So the church does have some authority in these areas. Christ has given us that. He didn't necessarily spell out absolutely everything for us and tell us, here's exactly how you're supposed to do everything. He didn't do that. He does allow the church, under the guidance of the Holy Spirit, under the supervision of the Holy Spirit, to make some choices and some decisions here. Again, that's in a qualified sense. Don't take it too far. Don't say Michael says, hey, novelty is okay. No, I mean, there's a sense in which it's not okay. I mean, in the sense that St. Stephen, I believe it was, who condemned, novelty. And he was there talking about rebaptism. There's that sense in which we would say no novelty, no innovation, none. Just kind of depends on what we're talking about and what sense, what exactly is the object of what we're discussing. Okay, with all those preliminary remarks, I think we're ready to talk about communion in the hand. I hope, I'm sure there will be somebody who comes and says, but wait. And I'll have to qualify my answer even further. That's okay. All right, Saint Cyril of Jerusalem. This is one that we hear often, right? It's often repeated. And there are some who contest the authenticity of this particular catechetical lecture that this quote comes from. So I recognize not all accept it as authentic to St. Cyril. That it is early in the first millennium is not disputed. It's just, is this something St. Cyril said? Maybe, maybe not. But it does go to show that this is there in the first millennium. When thou goest to receive communion, go not with thy wrists extended, nor with thy fingers separated, but placing thy left hand as a throne by thy right, which is to receive so great a king, and in the hollow of the palm receive the body of Christ, saying, Amen. Now, it's not in this particular quote that I have there, but a little bit after that, if I'm not mistaken, he talks about being very careful in doing this, very careful not to let any particle fall, if I recall correctly. Whereas that's not what is being done today, right? So when people appeal to St. Cyril of Jerusalem to back up what's going on today, we have a problem, because he is careful to note that you have to be careful not to let anything fall, not to let anything be lost. So again, if you want to appeal to St. Cyril, okay, let's do it. Well, let's appeal to also what he says about taking care of the host. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about some other things that had to take place before reception of the host, like that you had to have a washing of the hands, and it was more of a liturgical washing of the hands, just kind of like you have a liturgical washing of the hands in the Jewish faith. In fact, I remember we had to do, on the Sabbath, we had to wash our hands with this specific cup, and it wasn't really about actually cleaning your hands. It was more of a liturgical kind of washing of your hands. So it's kind of the same thing here. But yeah, there were some other things that went along with it. In fact, the woman had to use a white cloth on her hand if she was going to receive on her hand. So anyways, another one that you'll hear a lot is St. Basil. And let me get to the screen here. Sorry, it's a little odd getting to this third screen here. Okay, he says, it is good and beneficial to communicate every day, so daily communion, and to partake of the holy body and blood of Christ, for he distinctly says, he that eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life. And who doubts that to share frequently in life is the same thing as to have manifold life? I indeed communicate 4 times a week, on the Lord's Day, on Wednesday, on Friday, and on the Sabbath. And on the other days, if there is a commemoration of any saint, it is needless to point out that for anyone in times of persecution to be compelled to take, so he's talking here about in times of persecution, if they're compelled to take communion in his hands without the presence of a priest or minister, is not a serious offense. In other words, they are allowed to touch the host in these cases, in the case of persecution, as long as custom sanctions this practice. From the facts themselves, all the solitaries in the desert, so you have your hermits, where there's no priest, they take communion themselves, keeping communion at home, so they kept them in their homes. And at Alexandria and in Egypt, each one of the laity, for the most part, keeps the communion at his house, so they're keeping it at home. And this isn't necessarily anymore in times of persecution. That was more previously in times of persecution. Now they're just keeping it in their own house, and participates in it when he likes. So they receive communion whenever they like. For when once the priest has completed the offering and given it, the recipient participating in it each time as entire is bound to believe that he properly takes or receives it from the giver. And even in the church, when the priest gives the portion, the recipient takes it with him, complete power over it, and so lifts it to his lips with his own hand, so he's using his hand, has the same validity whether one portion or several portions are received from the priest at the same time. So it really doesn't matter how much of the Eucharist you're receiving. Even if you receive a fragment, you've received the full body, blood, soul, and divinity. So it's not like, okay, if you have, that much, it's more grace than that much. No. Okay. That's one we see often. And, some are going to point out that this has to do with times of persecution alone. I know how you could read it that way, sure. But it seems like he goes on to talk about people who are in their homes and they participate in it whenever they like. Are they doing this because of persecution, or is this just a practice that they have? I don't know. He's not very clear about that there. All right, Pope Cornelius. And this one is kind of an odd one just because it's actually Eusebius quoting something from a heretic, really. And Pope Cornelius also, I believe, notes it, which is why I have it listed here under Pope Cornelius, which I'm getting it also not only from Eusebius, but Jungmann quotes it as well in his book on the Mass. So he sees it as authentic. And the unhappy man does not taste until he has called down imprecations on himself. And instead of saying amen, he takes the bread. He says, I will never return to Cornelius, who's the lawful pope. So he's basically saying he's going to be in schism. But he takes the bread. So, it's clear that there's that actual reception in the hand is what's being implied here, according to Jungmann. You might not accept that one. You might say there's some problems here, or, okay, this was the practice of the schismatics. Yeah, but if this was the practice of the schismatics here, it's possible it was also the practice of those who were in communion with Pope Cornelius. All right, so St. Augustine, and yeah, this was actually Eusebius quoting Pope Cornelius, who notes, here's what the schismatics were saying, to my recollection. Now here's St. Augustine, something a little bit more authoritative than that. So he seems to have had, this is according to Jungmann, St. Augustine seems to have had something similar in mind when he remarked that no one partook of this flesh, and he says, where is it? Nisi prius adoraverit. And it's kind of hard for me to read because that screen is extremely far. Let me see if I could zoom in. All right. Here we go. It's a little easier to see. Sorry, the monitor's really far away. And I can't put it on one of these monitors because I have to have other programs here, so I have to deal with this one over here. But notice what he's talking about with the hands. He talks about using the hands. The faithful were to approach with the hands when they receive the Eucharist. That was the main point that Jungmann wants to point out from Augustine. So according to Augustine, the communicant was using their hands, manibus. All right. John of Damascus in the East, a patristic authoritative in the East. Wherefore, he says, with all fear and pure conscience and certain faith, let us draw near, and it will assuredly be to us as we believe, doubting nothing. Let us pay homage to it, all purity, both soul and body. So he's talking about venerating the host. For it is twofold. Let us draw near to it with an ardent desire, and with our hands held in the form of a cross, let us receive the body of the crucified one. So he's talking about receiving in the hand. And let us apply our eyes and our lips and our brows and partake of the divine coal. So he's actually talking about not only that, but putting it on your eyes, lips, and blah, blah, blah. in order that the fire of the longing that is in us with the additional heart derived from the coal may utterly consume our sins and illumine our heart, that we may be inflamed and deified by the participation with the divine fire. What do I make of that? I'm not opposed to it as long as we're doing it in a way that does not risk any fragment from being trampled on or something like that. Now, how are you going to do that with, safeguarding that? I don't know, which is why I wouldn't necessarily recommend that practice. But that they were receiving in the hand was clear. And he doesn't see it as sacrilege. Some today see communion in the hand as sacrilege, and unless the priest offers it to them on the tongue, they will not receive communion. I think that's a problem. You should say, okay, hey, no, my preference is to receive on the tongue, and that's fine, and I think you should be respected there. And the Vatican does, at least according to the Congregation for Divine Worship, thinks that you have that right and should be respected. But if for some reason the priest or the bishop is just being ridiculous and they are insisting on the hand, do you receive on the hand, or do you just walk away and say, no, that's sacrilege? Receive on the hand and do so reverently, and just make sure that you don't spill or, drop any particle. But it would be better to partake than not at all, because it's not sacrilegious. It's not sacrilegious. The early church didn't see it that way. I don't think you should too. Unless you're going to be condemning the practice of the first millennium and say the first millennium was sacrilegious in the way they received communion. And I think you have some major problems at that point. Let's see. Isaiah saw the coal, and he's appealing, of course, to Isaiah 6, where you have that whole thing going on. But coal is not plain wood, but wood united with fire. In like manner, also the bread of the communion is not plain bread, but bread united with divinity. But a body which is united with divinity is not one nature, but has one nature belonging to the body and another belonging to the divinity that is united to it, so that the compound is not one nature, but two. That's from the Orthodox Faith, Book 4, Section 13. So here's Council of Trullo, which of course was accepted in the Sixth Ecumenical Council. And there's some disputes on how much or how many of these canons did the West receive. It's hard to answer that. What we do know is, in some cases, it seems that the popes accepted just indiscriminately Trullo, period. And then others clarified, we accept the canons of Trullo insofar as they don't oppose any of the customs of Rome. Because there are some canons that go contrary to the customs of Rome, and so those would not be accepted. But this would not be one of those. This would not be one of those canons, right? This is not one of those that is opposed to the practice of Rome, because it was the case that they were still doing communion in the hand. And I'm going to show that. Although I've already shown a few in the West, I'm going to show some more. The great and divine Apostle Paul with a loud voice calls man created in the image of God, the body and temple of Christ, excelling, therefore, every sensible creature who by the saving passion has attained the celestial dignity, eating and drinking Christ, is fitted with all respects for eternal life, sanctifying his soul and body by the participation of divine grace. Wherefore, if anyone wishes to be a participator of the immaculate body in the time of the synaxis and to offer himself for the communion, let him draw near, arranging his hands in the form of a cross. So again, here, Trullo is just kind of repeating the same practice that was already there. It was just backing it up. And so let him receive communion of grace, but such as instead on their hands make vessels of gold or other material for the reception of the divine gift. So if they're receiving it in some other way, instead of on their hands, but something else like on gold or something, and by these receive the immaculate communion, like a liturgical spoon, for example, just throwing that one out there. We by no means allow to come as preferring inanimate and inferior matter to the image of God. So he's actually saying that's inferior to you receiving it on your hand. So it's excluding anybody who is going to receive, but receive not on the hand. But if anyone should be found imparting the immaculate communion to those who bring vessels of this kind, let me get back to it. It moved on me. Let them be cut off, as well as the one who brings them. Is he specifically talking about a liturgical spoon? No, he's not. No, he's not. Am I opposed to liturgical spoons? No, I'm not. No, no, that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying, pay attention. Okay. If you think that you don't have innovation in your liturgy, pay attention, because you do. Jesus wasn't using a liturgical spoon of gold with a golden chalice. He wasn't. Maybe there was a golden chalice there, but he wasn't using a liturgical spoon with it. I'm just saying. Anyways. All right. Theodore of Mopsuestia, or some call it Mopsuestia, however you pronounce it. So according to Theodore, the communicant should draw near with lowered eyes, both hands extended, and at the same time he should speak a word of adoration, since he is to receive the body of the king. So it's clear that he has his hands extended. This is from Jungmann quoting Theodore. If you want to go and look up the actual source, there it is. Now, this is from the Council of Rouen, I guess is how you pronounce it. It's a Western council. And here it's talking about, in Latin, that you are not to receive on the hand, but are to receive by the mouth. Right? By the mouth. So it's actually prohibiting reception of communion in the hand, but must be done by the mouth. Now, notice the date here, 878, end of the first millennium. It seems that, especially in the East, but also with Augustine and others, it seems that the practice, East and West, was generally reception of communion in the hands, until right here we see a shift. And this is a shift right at the time when you have a change in the West on going from leavened bread in the liturgy to unleavened bread in the liturgy. Well, again, I'm not necessarily saying this was a bad thing. I'm just saying recognize that your tradition of receiving on the tongue is not the original tradition. It was not even the dominant tradition in the first millennium. Again, am I opposed to it? No. Am I opposed to the way Eastern Byzantines do? No, of course I'm not. I'm not opposed to the Byzantine practice either. But neither the Byzantine practice nor the Tridentine Rite practice is what we just saw. Neither one of us are doing that. We all need to recognize that. Now, I want to quote something from Jungmann here in the Mass of the Roman Rite, because he's going to support what I say. And he's one of the most respectable scholars, and he's preconciliar too. And he's one of the most respected scholars when it comes to the history of the liturgy. Although, you have others like Fortescue that are also really, really good and helpful. But I don't know anybody who would actually take issue with Jungmann here and say, no, he doesn't know what he's talking about. So here's an expert on the liturgy of the Roman Rite who says the following: the laity intending to receive communion were expected to wash their hands beforehand. So he's talking about here's how they were receiving communion on the hand instead of by mouth or on the tongue. He is careful to note, all right, they washed their hands, they did these things. But again, notice, you have a scholar here, a liturgical scholar of the Roman Rite, admitting everything that I just said. It is not clear, however, if this washing of the hands was demanded only as needed or if it represented a settled ritual prescription. So again, we don't know if it was actually, are they washing dirt off their hands, or was this just some kind of, liturgical ritual washing, kind of like the priest does. The latter seems probable, for it was customary since ancient times to wash the hands before prayer, right? Be that as it may, in the plans for the great basilica, a fountain was placed in the forefront. That it was not intended merely as an ornament is seen clearly from the fact that in front of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, behind the splendid Constantinian fountain, a second, more modest one was erected by Pope Symmachus in order to satisfy the need. In Gaul, the women were not permitted to receive the body of the Lord in their bare hands, but were obliged to cover their hands in a white cloth. So we don't know if that was a practice everywhere. At least in Gaul, that was the case. And yeah, Alistair is mentioning some others like Chrysostom and Cyprian and others who are talking about communion in the hand. Right. These are by no means exhaustive, right? I mean, I'm just kind of throwing out a couple points here. There's more that would back this up, but at the end of the day, you have this scholar on the Roman right, who I would say is pretty much the go-to when it comes to the history of our liturgy. And he's admitting all this. So, I mean, this really shouldn't be in dispute. Even though I know in some of these articles you Google, they want to assert that it was pretty much the dominant case that they were receiving on the tongue, and it was rare to receive on the hand, and it was mostly persecution times. And no. Okay. He says, further, even stronger than this worry about possible misuse was the influence of the growing respect for the Eucharist. So, I mean, this is one of the reasons why there was this change, according to Human, because there was a growing respect for the Eucharist, possibility of misuse. Both together led to the practice of placing the sacred host in the mouth. But again, notice he's saying it's not the other way around. It's not that it went from communion on the tongue to communion in the hand. No, it's communion in the hand, and now later, towards the end of the first millennium, communion on the tongue. So if you're saying, hey, this is innovation, they just changed everything in the liturgy. No. They changed a lot of your innovations is what they did. And then they introduced it with some really bad practices in some cases. So it was just a mess. It's a mess. But you can't just say, well, let's return to the Tridentine way of doing things, and that solves all the problems. No, because we're back to square one. Square one was, at the time, right before the Second Vatican Council, square one was, we need to reform some things about the liturgy because we do have some novel practices here, and it would be better to go back to some of these earlier practices. That's square one. What we ended up getting was, okay, we're going to reform these things, but we ended up reforming them with other things that were problematic. And so it's maybe a temporary return to the Latin Mass. Oh, okay, but that's only bringing us back to square one. Okay, let's just say pretend all of the Latin Rite returned to the Tridentine Mass. Okay, great. I mean, that's better off than most of the Novus Ordos, right? Sure, but we still need to reform some things there. And so what do we do at this point? And is it realistic to really expect a return of the entire Latin Rite to the Tridentine Rite? No, that's unrealistic. That's not going to happen. What is probably going to happen is we're going to have to reform the reform. That's what's going to happen. Is the reform of the reform alive right now? No. No, it's not. It's dead. Under Pope Francis, it's dead. But maybe, and 50, 60, 70, 80 years, okay, maybe then we will have a climate in which we can have a good, genuine reform of the reform. And it would be good because it would have reformed some of the things that needed to be reformed in the Tridentine Mass. But it's also reforming some of the abuses and problems that we've seen here with the Novus Ordo. So we're a long ways away from it, but I would say it's easier to reform the Novus Ordo than to try to bring the entire Latin Rite back to the Tridentine Mass. It'd be so much easier to just reform. I mean, and so much more realistic, right? It's so much more realistic that that's what would happen. That being said, I support parishes that have the Latin Mass. I see it as a positive thing. I support those people who go there. Great. I'm just saying, don't think that you don't have novelty, and don't think that the Tridentine Rite is the end-all and be-all of the liturgy. It's not. It's not. A healthy Eastern liturgy, I would say in some ways, is more apostolic. In some ways, is more apostolic than some things in the Latin Rite. Now, am I saying that things in Latin Rite have abandoned something that's apostolic? No, but what I'm saying is that there are some things that are more in conformity with what was originally intended, what is the best practice, I should say, what best gives us the fullest expression of what was given to us. Not that the Latin Rite doesn't give us what was handed down, but I would say that some aspects of the Eastern liturgy give us a fuller expression of it, is what I'm really trying to get at here. All right, so back to what we were saying here with the quote. Both together led to the practice of placing the sacred host in the mouth, even though there may be some isolated instances of this practice in earlier times. The method dates substantially from the 9th century. 9th century. Which is what I just showed you, right? What was it, 890 something? I mean, because I'm quoting Jungmann there too, right? 878. In Mancy's collection. So yeah, 9th century. That's when you get this idea of communion on the tongue. Now, he does note, again, there may have been some isolated cases of communion on the tongue prior to the 9th century. Yes, but those are isolated cases. The majority was communion in the hand. I think it's really important to notice this. And again, I'm not just trying to beat up here on, trads, because I could easily apply this to some of the, I could easily apply this to the East. The East isn't really doing the same practice either. So there have been changes in the East. We all have innovations. They may be lawful. They may have been necessary. But they are innovations. Now, I hope that is helpful to y'all. Doing a quick survey here. Again, by no means exhaustive. I'm not saying that's an exhaustive list. And you might pull out a quote where somebody was receiving communion on the tongue, and that's great. According to Jungmann, those are isolated cases, and it does appear to be that way. If y'all have any questions, y'all can go ahead and send it to me. Michael secretly likes dunking on trats. No, but they're closest to home. So they're the ones that I'm going to critique the most. I'm going to critique the ones that are closest to home the most, right? We got to start with ourselves if we're going to start critiquing others. We really need to critique ourselves. If we're going to critique Orthodox and Protestants, we need to critique ourselves. And we also need to hear some of their criticisms, because some of their criticisms are accurate. We did change some things. And we need to recognize that. We need to admit it. And I think that would put us in a stronger position to then deliver a stronger apologetic, because if we're in denial, I mean, nobody's going to want to listen to us. But if we actually admit legitimate criticism, say, you actually do have a point, but here's how it's not a fatality to us. And by the way, here's also how you're inconsistent, because here's how it applies to you. If we're able to do that, then we're able to have a much, much stronger apologetic. Let's see, Joachim, closest to home, what a good insight. Orthodox frustrate me more than anyone else. Right. But, and I do criticize Eastern Orthodox. I try to do so charitably, but I do criticize Orthodox. But I'm going to first criticize my Latin Rite brothers first, because I'm technically in the Latin Rite, even though I'm probably Eastern Catholic and the way I think, but not in all things. But I probably am more Eastern Catholic than anything. But as far as where I actually go, I mean, it's a Latin Rite parish. So I'm going to critique those closest to me first. And yes, they're brothers in arms. Yes, we're on the same side. Yes, we're fighting the same battles. But I want to make sure that we're doing so properly informed, well informed, because otherwise we go out there and we're not properly informed. People aren't really going to find us persuasive. Is there a difference between justification by faith alone and salvation by faith alone? Well, I mean, it's a good question. It's off topic, but I mean, I'll give you a quick answer. When we talk about salvation, there's different aspects to it. There's a sense in which we could talk about salvation being identified with justification. And then there's a broader sense in which we could talk about salvation, right? That wouldn't just be limited to justification, but would include something like sanctification and glorification and other things like that. So it really just depends on what we mean. I'll answer it this way. There is a sense in which we could talk about justification by faith alone. I would say for initial justification, we could affirm justification by faith alone as long as we understand that faith to be a faith formed by charity. You can say justification by faith alone for initial justification. For ongoing justification, increases in justification, no, that's not by faith alone. That is by faith coupled by works done in grace that God does through us. So much more can be said there. All right. Favorite religious order? Ooh, I don't know. I don't know. Let me not answer that one. I'll get in trouble. Good question, though. Let's see what else. Could returning to communion in the hand be an example of excessive antiquarianism? Yeah, I mean, you have, popes condemning that, and that's fine. I understand that. I don't think that that's what's going on here, though. I would say that pertains to, for example, things like rebaptism, right? Rebaptism is an early practice by some, but just because it's early doesn't mean it was the right practice, right? Right? We can rule that one out because Pope Stephen and others recognized it was contrary to the universal practice of the church. That's not the same thing as, for example, communion in the hand, which was practically the universal practice. So I wouldn't equate the two. And I'm not saying that you equated them. You didn't. I brought that example up. But I'm trying to give you an example of what would fall under that condemnation, in my opinion. You would have to show me that somehow communion in the hand would fall under that condemnation. You'd have to give me some kind of evidence. I don't see it. But I do recognize just because it's old doesn't make it right. Doesn't make it right. Wholeheartedly affirm that. That's not my argument. That's not my argument. My argument is more this. Personally, I'm not even saying we should necessarily return to communion in the hand. I'm not even advocating for that. I'm fine with communion on the tongue or, through a liturgical spoon. I'm fine with that. That's fine. We can go, make sure we're doing that. Perfect. And if that's all we ever do from now on, okay, that's great. I wouldn't say we need to perform that. The point in why I'm bringing this up is because you can't call it sacrilege. It's not in and of itself sacrilegious to receive on the hand. It's not. You're calling the first millennial practice sacrilegious if you say that. Is the way in which some people do communion in the hand today sacrilegious? Yes. But it's not because they're receiving in the hand. It's because they are not attentive to that there are particles still remaining on their hands and they're dropping them all over the floor. That's what's sacrilegious, not the reception of the hand per se. And I understand the argument of these are unconsecrated hands. I get it. I understand it. Heard it a million times. The first millennium didn't have a problem with that. They didn't have that argument. So I would say that sounds like a really nice and pious, and I understand St. Thomas Aquinas says it. Sounds like a really pious idea here. And okay, maybe that's preferable, but I wouldn't say it's sacrilegious for unconsecrated hands to receive them. No, I wouldn't say that, because then I would really have to just be condemning the practice of the first millennium. I think that's when we go too far. That's what I'm really trying to get at here. Let's see what else. I'm looking. Am I canonically Latin Rite or Eastern Rite? Canonically? Technically? I'm Latin Rite, part of the Ordinariate. Technically. But we don't have any Ordinariate parishes. So I just go to a regular Novus Ordo parish, the best one that I can find. So I'm not Eastern Rite canonically. We don't have any Eastern rites. And I was initially received in the Latin tradition. So just because I went from Orthodoxy to Latin Rite doesn't mean I'm Eastern in any way. No. Now in theology and practice and the way I think, yeah, I'm probably more Eastern than anything. But there are some things that I would side with in the West over the East too. So I mean, I'm just kind of a blend of things. If you had to throw me in a category, it'd be closer to the East, but I don't fit any category. I don't fit to an Eastern Christian. I sound Latin. To a Latin Christian, I sound Eastern. I don't fit really in any category. Whenever I first joined, we had an ordinariate parish that was starting here, but it never got off the ground. But I was able to be admitted into the parish, and I received the sacraments through a local Novus Ordo parish, even though I was technically being given those sacraments by a regular Latin Rite Novus Ordo parish. I was still being received into the ordinariate. So very technically, I'm part of the ordinariate. But we don't have any ordinariates here anymore. That mission failed long before it really even got off the ground. I was one of the few that was admitted into the ordinariate. I was one of the first that was admitted into the ordinariate in America. One of the first. But again, we didn't have a parish that lasted, so I can't really say I'm ordinariate, even though technically I am. And yes, I understand that's part of the Latin Rite. So to answer your question, I'm Latin Rite. Would the frequency of communion make a difference? Make a difference to what? I guess I'm not following the question. Should we return to pre-55 Holy Week for Latin Mass? You know, I'm not opposed, but at the same time, I'm also not opposed to some of the preconciliar reforms that were made to Holy Week either. I understand that you have some arguments that you would say, okay, these might not be the best reforms. I'm not saying you specifically. There are those who would say that. It's not that big of a deal to me. Maybe not. I'm fine if we never did. At the same time, even if somehow we did, okay, let's say we go back to that. We still need to reform some things about the Tridentine Mass. And today's not the climate to do it. I recognize that. And I think at this point, look, I don't think it's going to happen. I'm just talking theoretically, right, that we would need to reform some things about the Tridentine Mass. But I'm a realist. I recognize that that's not going to happen. We can't even reform the stuff that we have in most of our parishes right now. How likely is it we're going to reform something like that? And should we reform something like the Tridentine Rite in today's climate? No, we should not. No, we should not. Just leave it alone. Leave it alone. Just back away. Walk away. That's kind of my approach right now. Just walk away. Leave it alone. Don't touch it. You're making it worse. It's kind of how I feel. Whenever sanity returns to the church in the Latin Rite, and we've really digested the reforms of Vatican II in a proper way, I think it's possible when we have level heads to reform the reform, to get where we need to be in the Latin Rite, to get the Novus Ordo where it needs to be, and we won't even have then a need to reform the Tridentine Mass. We wouldn't even have a need. Some things would resemble the Tridentine Mass, and then those things that differ from it, it wouldn't be necessary to go back and reform those things, because I think that those people would eventually end up coming into the Novus Ordo, realizing that, okay, it's not that bad anymore, and those parishes would flourish, and there would be reverence and respect in the Novus Ordo liturgy. So those things that people are attracted to from the Latin Mass, they would find in the Novus Ordo. And I think those parishes the Tridentine parishes would probably end up dying out if we had a good and healthy Novus Ordo parish. There just wouldn't be a need for it anymore. So, I mean, if things were done properly, right? But that's a big if. That's not going to be done anytime soon. So in the meantime, we need the Latin Masses, because it's way better than what you're going to get in most Novus Ordo parishes. But I'm kind of more just talking theoretically here, and also pointing out the fact that we have some inconsistencies. So that's why I'm talking about these things. When will sanity return to the Latin Rite? Not in our lifetimes. Not in our lifetimes. It might get worse in our lifetimes. I expect it to. It sure has gotten worse lately. Yeah, not anytime soon, but it will. But it will return, right? I mean, we've had crazy times in church history. I recognize nothing has ever been this crazy. I recognize that, but just as we got through some of those crazy times, I mean, you had, goodness, I mean, you've had the Babylonian exile of the church going into, France, the papacy over in France, in Avignon. Then right after that, you have a problem with conciliarism. And then right after that, you have the sealing of the great schism between East and the West. And so, I mean, and then, right in, actually before then, we had the Fourth Crusade. And I mean, that was a period in time that was pretty rough. And there were other things going on then that was pretty rough. But I mean, things got better after that. Things are going to get better after this too. Just probably not in our lifetime. So hang in there. If all you have are bad Novus Ordo parishes, go to a Latin Mass. Go to a Latin Mass. Yeah, I have some criticisms about the Latin Mass, some things that we need to reform, but I'll take it any day over the average Novus Ordo. But if we're just talking objectively, were there some things that needed to be reformed and that were reformed and some good things that came from the Novus Ordo? Yeah, but are they being done right? No. And so there's a million qualifications that we have to make when we have this discussion. And most people aren't qualified, let me rephrase. They aren't qualifying their position well enough to have these discussions. And most people aren't nuanced enough to have these discussions. So there's a lot of confusion here. Brian says, I think it's cute that Michael thinks Novus Ordo is going to be fixed. Do you really believe that the vast majority of your parishes in the Latin Rite in the Catholic Church are just going to die out and or going to be conformed to the Latin Mass? Do you really believe that? Obviously, it's so much more likely that when God heals his church, that he's just going to heal what's already there, right? Not this major shift to the Latin Mass. That's just unrealistic. Is it possible God may do that? Yeah. Is it likely? Definitely not likely. It's probably not what God's going to do to fix his church. He's probably going to reform the Novus Ordo. So I'm just being reasonable here. When in church history, Brian also says we're 60-70% of the clergy gay. I get it, Brian. I'm getting the impression that you're a troll, so I'm sorry. You're gone. But I will answer your question. There were periods and times where the church struggled with that prior to the Novus Ordo or post-conciliar era. At the same time, does that somehow mean that this is the Church of Christ? No, please. Not sure where you're coming from or what position or what communion you belong to, if any, but whatever it is, if you were unblocked and you told me, and I'm not going to unblock you for you to just give me that answer, I would be able to tell you problems with your own communion, whatever it is. And if you have no problem, or if you have no communion, I would say that's a problem in and of itself. But if you had a communion, I'm going to point that argument right back at you. Regardless of what communion it is, I'll start giving you examples of your own communion that has that same problem or something similar to it. And, of course, you're going to say, well, that's okay in our cases. That somehow doesn't mean we've defected from the faith. But in my case, we defected from the faith. Let's see what else. 5-A-Day Productions, you always sound so black-pilled, but I'm glad that you're still laughing and preserving in the faith. Am I black-pilled? I don't know. I forget the shades of the pills at this point, what black pill was. I thought black pill was like when you were just out there insane, crazy. But I could be wrong. Am I black-pilled in that sense? No. I'm qualified pilled. whatever color that is, that's what I am. I qualify things. I'm trying to be nuanced. I try to hold to a nuanced perspective that not a whole lot of people in the church probably hold to today, for better or worse. Maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong. If I'm wrong, help me see my error. If I'm right, join me, kind of like Augustine said, right? So, let me see what else I can find in the chat. I'm looking. One second, y'all. Sorry for all the dead air. It's hard for me to read this stuff and talk at the same time. Okay. Since the Greeks and Romans held the left hand as far as inferior to the right hand, wouldn't they have not touched the Eucharist with the left hand? Well, let me go back to it. What was it? Which hand did Cyril say it was? Let's go back to it. Put it back on my screen. Thou goest to communion, go not with thy wrists extended, nor with thy fingers separated, placing thy left hand as a throne to thy right hand, which is to receive the king. Yeah, he puts it that way. But honestly, what does it really matter? Just whichever hand. Don't think it matters, ultimately speaking. Just kind of like whichever sign, the way you sign yourself with the form of the cross, whichever side you go to first, right or left to right, whichever one you do, does it really matter? No. Are these things to fight over? And I'm not saying you're fighting over them. I'm just saying some people in general would fight over these things, and I don't think it ultimately matters. Let me see what else I can find. Yeah, Joachim says, leave it alone. That's how I feel about the Orthodox liturgy. Yeah. Yeah, but then you say, I certainly don't have more wisdom than St. John and Basil. But, that's debated whether or not the liturgies of Chrysostom and Basil actually go back to substantially Chrysostom and Basil. Maybe they do, maybe they don't, but that is debated. But either way, I still think that they're to be revered and they're wonderful liturgies, whether they do or don't. And I wouldn't reform the liturgy. Just leave it alone at this point. If it's going to reform, let it happen organically. Don't let it. Not that there was ever really a time that just fully organically liturgy developed. I know Ratzinger talks about that, but let's be real. There were cases in the West and the East that it wasn't necessarily organic. There were actual changes made by the Pope, and so but I understand in substance, substantially it was organic compared to a committee changing things. I get that, and that's true. And I would say just let it happen in a natural way. Don't just start forming liturgical committees and let's start changing this. And I think this will be cool. And I think this is older. And I think this is better. And I think this would sound, interesting in the Mass if we heard this or did this. Just leave it alone. Just, especially today. Again, today is not the climate. We're not responsible enough to do that. We're just not. Maybe if we were in a position right now in church history where we were really responsible in the liturgy, we might be able to do that, but that's not where we're at, so I don't think it should be on the table. Do I agree with Bishop Schneider on what? What was the question? Josh was asking. I don't know what the question was. What can we do to revitalize monasticism to make it integral to our daily lives? That's a great question. In fact, I was watching the Coptic hermit, Father Lazarus, the other day. I was rewatching that video on him, the anchorite, and it was really inspiring. And he just talks about there's a sense in which there's some things that an anchorite or even a monk, but especially an anchorite, is able to do that you in the world just never will be able to. But I do think that we could take some of their ways of doing things and incorporate it into our daily lives. Some of their prayer rules, or some of the things in the rule of Saint Benedict, we can take and apply it to our daily lives. There have been some good books written on doing that. But yeah, I mean, in reality, it's going to be impossible for us to really live that kind of a life and have that kind of a devotion unless we didn't have children and a job and stuff like that. So how can we get closer to it? Take some of their prayers. Take the daily office that, whatever monastic group that you're interested in uses, and try to incorporate that in your own life throughout the day. I mean, I was a Benedictine oblate, and we have the actual what am I thinking here? The prayer services that they use throughout the day. Well, 7 times a day, actually. They have it in paperback that they sold in the monastery. It's Clear Creek Abbey. If you've heard of it, you can check it out. I think they sell them online too. So if you're interested in the Benedictines there, which they're really good. They do the Latin Mass only. They are very, very solid liturgically. You could grab their prayer rules and probably purchase them online. So, and just use that in your daily life. They have Prime and Lauds and all those in 5 separate booklets. But I don't know if they still have them, though. I mean, I have my copies, but I got these years ago, so I don't know if they still sell those, but they should be able to. And if you don't like them, find another monastery that you're interested in and get their prayer rule and incorporate that into your daily life the best that you can. Let's see. Can you explain how the Eastern churches can sidestep church teachings like purgatory and indulgences if they are part of the ordinary magisterium, or are they not? Are we talking about Eastern Catholics or Eastern Orthodox? Because if we're talking about Eastern Catholics, an Eastern Catholic is bound to believe all of the dogmas on purgatory and indulgences. They're not bound to believe some of the theological opinions that we have in the West about those things, but they are to believe all of the dogmas surrounding those things. They're required to as Eastern Catholics. Eastern Orthodox, I don't know if that's what you're asking me. If you're asking me about Eastern Orthodox, well, they don't just sidestep those. They sidestep papal supremacy and papal infallibility and other things. So I get the feeling you're asking me about Eastern Catholics, and I would say no. Here's the way it works with the magisterium. You are required, no matter what rite you're part of, to hold to all those things that are definitively with divine and Catholic faith, if they are taught, with one particular, if they are taught with one degree of force, and then some things you're to hold definitively, to be held definitively if they're taught with a lower force, and then some things you're to hold to with a assent of intellect and will if they're taught with a lower degree. And we could talk about those specific degrees and what case is at this level of assent, what case is at that level of assent, what case is it. That's a whole show. But you're required to hold to those things with those particular levels of assent, regardless of which rite you're part of. It's not just for Latin rite that you have to apply submission of intellect and will, or to be held definitively, or divine and Catholic faith. And by the way, if you want a quick commentary on it, go and get it's online, the commentary for the Professio Fidei, the concluding paragraphs of the Profession of Faith, Professio Fidei. It's the commentary of Ratzinger and Bertone, published under the CDF. And you can read about those 3 instances In which case is it this doctrine? In which case is it this doctrine? And so in what case do I owe this level of assent? You can go and read that if you would like a more thorough answer. But the point is that everybody has to hold to that as a Catholic. Latin Rite, Eastern rites, we don't have any freedom there. Where we do have freedom is the same place where Latin Rite Catholics have freedom. I'm not bound as a Latin Rite Catholic to maintain St. Thomas Aquinas on everything. I can hold to a more Scotus view. I could hold to a more Palamite view. I'm not bound to hold to one particular school of thought on just everything, unless the magisterium has intervened. Just as I can do that as a Latin Rite Catholic, an Eastern Catholic can do the same thing on those matters that have not been settled definitively or taught authoritatively by the magisterium. So we all have freedom there. It's just in those cases that have been taught definitively or at least authoritatively, we do owe a certain level of assent to them, with few exceptional cases. What else we have here? What elements of your thinking are Eastern versus Western? I'm disappointed you're not a hardcore Thomas Manualist from you. Right. I would say chrismating infants and giving them, I'm sorry. Yeah, I mean, chrismating infants and giving them communion. I would say one thing that I think needed to happen with the Second Vatican Council that the Eastern Catholics or Eastern churches were already doing was restoring the chalice. I get why it was removed due to the Eucharists and their heresy, and it was there to practically fight against it. I get that, but I haven't met a Eucharist ever. So, I think we're beyond that at this point. It's okay to now let go of that one and let's bring back the chalice. I understand there are cases where people are irresponsible. I've seen it myself. But properly guarding against that, I think that we need to have that. So I'm more Eastern there. I'm more Eastern and probably in my spirituality as far as the prayers. Yeah, I would say those are kind of the big areas. Big thing for me is chrismation and communion for infants. I don't think that, infants are going to hell without it, right? So it's not like they're being deprived of salvific graces. But just because they're not being deprived of salvific graces doesn't mean that there aren't still some reasons and benefits for it. So, yeah, there we go. What else do we have here? Trying to see if I see anything else. Josh says, sorry, I was asking in regards to Bishop Schneider's crusade of reparation for Eucharistic abuses. He doesn't seem fond of communion in the hand, even though it's novel. Bishop Schneider reached out to me when he first came out with that crusade, and he asked me to help promote it, which I did, and I respect that, and I respect him tremendously in everything he does. I don't agree with everything, but I understand why he holds that position. I don't agree with him on it, but I understand why he holds that position, and I can respect it, and I get where he's coming from. I mean, in today's climate, is communion in the hand a good idea? No, it's not. So in that sense, I'm not fond of communion in the hand either. I mean, if we're just talking about people today, the way it is, and you just said, Michael, you have a preference right now, communion in the hand or on the tongue, what do you do? I'm going to say on the tongue, obviously, right? Obviously. So, I mean, I'm not saying this is my preference. It's actually not. I'm just saying you can't call it sacrilegious in and of itself. That's all I'm really trying to get at. Hugh asked, what hobbies do you have? Yeah, believe it or not, learning is my hobby. Learning is definitely a hobby. I like playing basketball. I've been getting back to working out lately. Those are some hobbies. Maybe once in a blue moon, maybe once every 1 month or 2 months, I can actually play my PlayStation. I have all these games that I almost never get to play them. But yeah, I would say basketball. Although it's been really cold lately. I've been going out there playing basketball in the freezing cold, and that's been a challenge. So, what's the origin of trad or rad trad view of communion on the hand being modern and heretical? I understand over the last 50 years there have been abuses. Yeah, I mean this is where it's coming from, right? They're reacting against the post-conciliar abuses. There were reforms that were made, and they weren't made in the best way when it comes to communion in the hand at all. That was imposed in a very negative way. But in and of itself, it's not evil, it's not wrong, it's not sacrilegious. The way in which it was done was very problematic. And so they're reacting against that, the way in which it was done. They're reacting against the abuses that they see because they see people, how careless they are, coming to receive the Eucharist with a jersey on or something and just throwing it in their hand and then eating it like it's a Cheeto or something. I get that. And so there's going to be that natural inclination to say, something's wrong with this. Why can't we go back to communion on the tongue? Because I see a whole lot of reverence with those churches that are doing communion on the tongue. So I'm now opposed to communion on the hand. That's kind of how it happens. And I would say you can be opposed to that practice in today's climate as long as you recognize in and of itself it's not sacrilegious. In and of itself it's okay. It's just the way in which it's being done is problematic. How would you handle heretical advice in the confessional? I was recently told not to worry about doubting my faith because all religions lead to God. I would ignore the advice that is given to you in the confessional that does not line up with what is taught by God in the church. Ignore it and try to find a better priest. Try to find somebody better. If that's all that you have available, if all you literally have is a priest who can be no more than a sacrament dispenser, not putting priests down, but I'm saying that priest clearly isn't doing much more than that. If that's all you can find, okay, go there for your confession, but try to find something in the meantime, something better, a priest who cares about his vocation, believes what the church teaches, and is doing his best to live it and teach it to others. So, but I get it. That's a tough situation, especially if you don't have anybody else available in your area. Go to it, get your get the sacrament, and ignore what they're telling you. Think about it like this: there was no such thing as advice in the confessional in the early church. I mean, there was just that wasn't there. Right? Confession was done very differently. It was done very rarely. You might go to confession once in a lifetime. It was very rare. It wasn't done in the way that was done today. It was a public thing. All these are little innovations that we've added. And are they helpful to have good advice in the confessional? Of course it is. Of course it is. Is it indispensable to the sacrament? No, it's not. What about the argument that communion in the hand leads to Christ being trampled? Well, that's what I've been discussing the whole time, right? Haven't I been discussing that? It doesn't have to lead to that, does it? No, it doesn't have to. It does not have to if you are being careful, if you're doing it in a reverent way that they did it, in the early church. Not that there weren't abuses in the early church and people didn't drop the Eucharist or something, but generally they were careful to do it respectfully. That's what I'm saying. Just saying, do it reverently, do it respectfully. I would not walk away from a mass and just say, well, they don't offer on the tongue, so I'm not going to receive today. Don't do that. Don't do that. Go ahead and receive on your hands. Be very careful, and if you see anything else is there, consume it. And do look, because something will be there, I guarantee it. When you look at your hand after you receive, there will be some particles there. Consume them. And that will be so much better than just walking away from God's graces. So much better. Just to make a point, or just to be a stickler, just to make a statement that nobody's listening to. You're shortchanging yourself when you do that. What else we have? Trying to see what else. Did I miss anything? How do you respond to those that use the forgeries of donation of Constantine and the pseudo-Isidorian decretals against the papacy? Yeah, it's interesting, even though some of those were accepted in the East, right? But putting that issue to the side, the papal claims don't rest on any of those, so that's how I'd responded to it. I would respond by providing sources that are not disputable, sources that are not part of some kind of forgery. And by the way, this happened East and West, right? You had forgeries in the East too. And you had cases in the East where they were erasing things in manuscripts. And you had those problems. It happened on both sides. And again, I don't think any of the Catholic claims rest on those. What's the difference between communion on the hand today versus before? Well, again, women had to receive with a cloth in their hand, and at least in some parts, like Gaul. And then, number two, they took great care not to drop any particle, whereas today, we're not doing that. We're doing a terrible job with that. Also, they were receiving communion on the hand with leavened bread, whereas we're receiving communion on the hand with unleavened bread. This is refreshing given the normal traditional narrative. That's what we're trying to do, right? That's one of the reasons why we have this show. There's multiple reasons, but that's a big one, is to offset some of those tendencies that we see in certain schools of thought. Anything else? I heard Bishop Schneider say the communion on the hand was done with a veil over the hand. Well, that's what I was talking about with a white cloth for women. I don't know of men doing this. There may have been cases where men were doing it. I don't know. I just know of cases where women were required to do that. And that was, again, in Gaul. I don't know if it was done elsewhere. Don't know. If you have information there, let me know. Thoughts on the spiritual combat by Scupoli. I loved it. I thought it was very helpful. But it's been about 6-7 years since I've read it, so it's not fresh on the brain. Is there anything else? Hercule says, thank you for being honest. Well, I appreciate it. Okay. Well, I think that's it. So we'll go ahead and in there. Do you cover already why we switched types of bread? Yeah, I mean, according to Ewan, it was because it was for the same reason why we switched the communion on the mouth. It was pretty much to safeguard against certain abuses, and there was an increase in our respect and reverence for the Eucharist, and so they felt it was best to just go ahead and do that. I get it. I understand that, but I don't want to say that you have to do that, because I would then be saying that the early church was in error and my Eastern brothers are in error, and I'm not going to say that. Yeah. All right, well, we'll go ahead and end it there. There's a good question there about Pope Francis, but we'll address that another time. We can probably do a whole show on it. This one's more related to our topic. Do random sinful thoughts before taking the Eucharist make you in a state of grace? No. Make you not in a state of grace. I'm sorry. No. It has to be grave matter. It has to be full consent of the will, full knowledge, not some random quick thought. Yeah, you're going to have random thoughts right before receiving communion that are not good thoughts. You do not need to entertain them. You start dwelling on them, focusing on them, giving yourself over to them with the consent of your will. That's a different issue. But that's not what you're asking me when you say random stuff just come into your mind like that. No. If you're not giving consent to them, you're not dwelling on them, you're not just giving yourself over to it, that's not something to worry about. That's just a temptation and you're fighting it. There's nothing inherently on your part sinful about it. Off topic, but can ordinary magisterium ever teach error? Yes, it can. And I've given some examples. John the 22nd on the Beatific Vision and papal homilies. Those are magisterial. Those are really low level, but that's an error. Honorius, he taught error in his letter to Sergius. That was ordinary magisterium. Okay, y'all. Well, we'll go ahead and end it there. I appreciate y'all's engagement in the chat. Very, very lively today. And I hope y'all continue to watch. Don't forget to, check us out at patreon.com/Reason and Theology if you would like to support us. Also, check us out at reasonandtheology.com. We have some articles on there. And then we also have the St. Maximus the Confessor Institute, where we have lectures going on, also at reasonandtheology.com. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share this on your social media.